Well, welcome everybody to Nourishing Minds and Bodies on Campus, a conversation with Dr. Amanda Swartz, TCU's eating disorder counselor. Welcome, Amanda. Thank you so much for, interacting with me today.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
Wonderful. I want to start off by just giving Dr. Amanda a proper introduction. She's got a lot of wonderful credentials that are very relevant to the conversation. So she earned her doctorate in psychology, in clinical psychology, with concentrations in group psychotherapy and health psychology. She earned her certified eating disorder specialist and supervisor certification through the International Association for Eating Disorder Professionals and has significantly progressed how Texas Christian University addresses eating disorders within its student body. For the last 15 years, she has been passionately working with the university counseling centers. She developed the TCU eating disorder interdisciplinary team in order to support students through this collaborative model and developed the disordered eating and eating disorder team for the Big 12 conference student athletes. Dr. Swartz is passionate about working with the LGBTQ population and has twice been honored with the TCU Pride Award, which honors a TCU staff or faculty member for exceptional contributions in promoting awareness of issues in the LGBTQ community and in creating an inclusive campus for all gender identities and expressions. So again, thank you for being here.
Thank you. That was a nice introduction. I appreciate it.
Of course. And just for everyone else, I am Jessica Cantor. I am the Director of Communications at Bell and Ivy, and I'm also a health and mental health journalist. So first off, I'd really like to know how you developed a passion for working with students with EDs. What brought you to this specific area?
Well, by growing up in the 90s, I was exposed to a lot of diet culture, a lot of restrictive culture, and I was never in a small body. I was never in like the typical body that fit, especially in that era. And I started to see eating disorders develop in my friends. I started to see really disordered eating happen in family, friends. It was kind of everywhere. And then I really noticed a spike when I went to college. And so that was when I decided that it was something that I wanted to be part of the solution for and started learning how I could make progress in it, which is part of what led me down the clinical psychology route to learn more about it, and then into college counseling centers where I can actually have an impact on how clients with eating disorders or disordered eating are actually able to access help right at their university. So a lot of it started by growing up in that thin, idealistic 90s diet culture.
Yes, we all remember that, the quote, something doesn't taste as good as skinny feels or something like that, which just is completely ridiculous.
You can never be too rich or too thin, like that kind of stuff.
Exactly. Now, you mentioned that you not only noticed that it got worse in college, but now you're focused on working with college students directly. What do you think kind of changes from, high school into college that makes it such an important time for treating eating disorders?
I think there's a lot of things that change. And one of the primary ones is it's a huge period of transition. And what we know is that students who struggle with eating concerns really struggle with change and transition. So you're taking something that's already hard for them and like putting it on overdrive. They're moving, they're making new friends, they're learning how to go to college classes, all the things that come with moving into a college setting. Then there's also the huge aspect that food changes a lot when you move to college, because a lot of people come from a household where dinner is just on the table when they get home from whatever they did after school, and that's what they eat, and they don't necessarily think a lot about it. Or we have other populations who maybe had food security issues and were not exposed to so much food, and then they walk into a dining hall that is full of food, and that can be incredibly overwhelming. So we find that for a lot of students, the food situation at school, having to feed themselves, is incredibly overwhelming. And a lot of people don't come with the knowledge of really how to do it. And so then they end up maybe on social media trying to figure out how to do it, and they can get caught in some pretty rough weight loss traps, things like that when they're trying to learn healthy habits, but that doesn't always happen. So those are two of my biggest things for coming to college. I could answer that question for an hour, but those are two of the biggest ones.
And you brought up social media, which I definitely have a couple of questions for you on that specifically. But first, I do want to hear about the comprehensive collaborative care model that TCU uses to support students.
Okay.
Now, you helped build the ED track, and we've heard a lot of great things about the work that the school is doing. Can you talk about the model and, how it works, how it engages with students, just kind of a high-level overview?
So I'll give you a high-level overview of the comprehensive collaborative care model, because that's what the eating disorder track fits into. And I'm lucky to work under Dr. Eric Wood. He's our director. And he came up with this comprehensive collaborative care model as a solution to the problem seen in college counseling right now, that we simply cannot out-hire the student need. There is no way we are going to hire enough clinicians to meet the needs. So we have to do something different. And so he has come up with something different, and our tracks are vast. We have a triage and crisis track. We have kind of a general therapy track. We have a peer support community track. We have what I'm working in, which is the specialized services for high need student track. And that's where the eating disorder track falls. And there's tracks I didn't even mention because it would take me forever to tell you all about the model. But the model has been working so well because it's really looking at what a student needs and trying to provide them with that. We also obviously have a referral track for students that we maybe can't help with in our model. So we work with our community providers for that. I am going to give a shout out. Dr. Wood is giving a keynote speech in the next couple of days through this summit, and I highly recommend you go hear his talk. He is a great speaker. He has a great model and a great team working with him. And so I can't help but say, please go hear him talk.
Wonderful. Yes. So back to the model. So tell me a little bit about the ED track. What sets it apart from other, counseling centers at other universities working with students?
Well, my hope is that a lot of counseling centers are starting to do this. So I hope it's not that different. But I think that when I think that one of the ways that it separates out is that we make sure that the student meets the criteria for the model. And we have two big criteria. There's three, but the third is light. So one, the student has to have a high motivation for treatment, and they have to have a primary diagnosis of an eating disorder or significant disordered eating. And we want to have seen symptoms in the last 3 months. And the reason we added that one is because we were getting some people coming in who maybe had eating disorders in middle school or high school, but really anxiety was now the problem. So we wanted to make sure they were getting where they needed to be, which was a different track. So that's why we have those three. And what the track does is it sets a student up to hopefully be paired with a certified eating disorder specialist. I feel very lucky to work at a university that has a certified eating disorder specialist there. I'm lucky to get to be there. And we now have a second part-time certified eating disorder specialist. So to have two on a campus, I know is almost unheard of. So I love that. And once we do that pairing, it's also a multidisciplinary track. So students are going to be expected, and this is where the motivation comes in. They're going to be expected to be seen by someone at the health center. They're going to be expected to meet with a dietitian if that meets their needs. Depending on the student, we may involve a dean of students. We may involve psychiatry. So we have all these different departments working together to support the one student around living better and getting through their eating disorder. So that's the way it's working. And we work to make this as seamless as possible for the student, because we know that coming in for help is hard and we don't want to make it any harder. So I'll use my example of the health center. We recently had a debacle where I sent a student over for an eating disorder assessment and they sent her back to me for an eating disorder assessment. And I thought, all right, I have to do better. We have to do better. So I now have I've had a working relationship with the director of the health center for a long time. And so we've now worked out a much easier line. I won't lay out the whole thing, but now the student goes from me to the director of the health center, where she will get her eating disorder assessment accomplished. We know the director is going to do all the right things. We've discussed what different medical interventions need to be done, just to assess every student and make sure they're healthy before we start working with them as an outpatient.
Got it. Yeah. And so for the students who, are coming onto campus for the first time, how is the counseling center engaging with them, not only to let them know that, this support exists, but also to kind of help them understand, the signs and symptoms so that they can maybe understand what's going on with them and get help, or be alert just in case it comes down the line?
So this is one of the things where we are really lucky that we work on a very interconnected campus. A lot of this is actually being done by our wellness center. Our wellness center has peer educators, and research shows that peers hear better from peers than they do from us. So our peer educators are constantly doing outreach, and they do a lot of outreach around body image. They do a lot of outreach around eating disorders so that people can start to recognize the signs. And with that, at any of their events, they have the counseling center information. So even if they were at an event about an LGBTQ population, they would still see the flyer for the counseling center. So they're getting exposed to it. The other way I've been able to work is to really try to educate my campus partners so that people in the deans of students office start to notice signs, and professors start to notice signs. And people in the health center that may not have been as familiar with eating disorders start to notice signs, so that they can actually refer students in when they start to see the signs if the student hasn't seen it yet.
Mm-hmm. And so just a couple of statements ago, you mentioned that, one of the criteria for entering the track is that a student be motivated. How do you support students who are not motivated? And do you kind of keep an eye on them so that things don't get, worse along the way and where they need, more drastic help?
So that's an interesting question. A lot of it depends on where the motivation level lies. If they know they need help and they're willing to get some help, but maybe just aren't ready for the wraparound services where they're getting health center, psychiatric, all the different services, maybe they're not motivated for that, but they're motivated to make some changes. What I'll often do is have them see a clinician that's not in the eating disorder track to work on some motivational interviewing about what's getting in the way and what might have to happen to get them ready to be able to make those steps. Because if somebody's not motivated, I'm never going to be able to support them enough to get them to the health center and things like that. And we always say we cannot undertreat a client. So just because they may not want to do something doesn't mean it's okay not to do it, because I'm not willing to undertreat a client.
It really is amazing to hear that because you have the collaborative care model, all of the different tracks are kind of paying attention to each other and understanding, okay, well, so this is, a co-occurring disorder, but this may not be the main thing that needs to be treated. So it's really refreshing to hear that you guys are, continuously in communication and working together to make sure that the students get the care that they need and aren't just like, oh, we saw the student, we did our job, let's send them out into the world. Now we can go, let people who are overseeing us understand that, we're working with the students and call it a day.
Right. I feel good about that.
Well, and so, because we have heard such amazing work, are you able to share a couple of, anecdotes of students who have successfully gone through the program?
Sure. One I want to share, I have to back up and tell you a little more information about one of our tracks is the peer support communities. Mm-hmm. And so we are doing, I can't even tell you how many peer support communities we have right now, probably about 15. Wow. And they all meet different needs, and they are not groups. They're not clinical groups. They're just communities of people coming together around a similar challenge. So I co-lead Nourish with a colleague, and it's for students who want to improve their relationships with food and or body. And we really stress that it is a community. It's not just a meeting. Mm-hmm. So it started during Zoom. Excuse me. It started during Zoom. And 3 of our members who came to know each other well decided they were going to do a weekly recovery dinner. Had nothing to do with us. They invited everyone in the group, and 3 decided to do it. And so they did weekly Friday night dinners where they all met their own meal plans. They sat together on Zoom and talked. And it was just such a cool thing to see the community really creating itself, because that was something that the co-leader and I had nothing to do with. And so that was one place that we really saw. That wasn't the exact question you asked, but I wanted to give that first because one of the women who was in that meal group was one of the first people to go through the path, through the track. I did ask her permission before sharing this, and she was okay with it because she's now in strong recovery and wants people to know that they can get better. And when she came to me, she was in a graduate program, really struggling. And we had to work on very, very basic things, like getting her to eat and really connecting her to getting a medical evaluation, getting a dietitian. We had to put all that in place. She actually used something that not a lot of students use, but it's called a recovery coach, which is someone in the community who's been through recovery and been through training, who sometimes went to meals with her, sometimes went shopping with her, really helped her with her recovery. And eventually she did end up in residential treatment, which was exactly where she needed to be. But she's told me that she doesn't think she would have gotten to the treatment she needed if she didn't do the pre-work in our eating disorder track to even realize that she had such an eating disorder. Mm-hmm. Because she kind of came in and thought, I have a little bit of a problem with food, which was just not the case, but it is pretty consistent with the denial of eating disorders. Mm-hmm. So she went through the track, went to residential, graduated, and she is now working as a full-time minister and looking to be a foster parent. And she now considers herself in full recovery and credits a lot of that to the intervention that she got early on through our eating disorder track and through the Nourish peer support community.
Wow, that's amazing. Yeah. Great. And that must feel great too, to have a clear example of the work that you all are doing and, how it's paying off, even if it's just one student.
Yeah. And I'll tell you, it's not just one student, but if it was just her, this would still be worth it.
Yeah, definitely. Wow. Well, so I kind of want to take the conversation back to when I did your introduction. Can we talk a little bit about how college athletes, need to be interacted with and treated in a different way, and the work that you've done for college athletes specifically in the ED world?
Sure. So we are part of the Big 12, which means we have a big athletic population, and all of our student athletes are Big 12 athletes, not just our football team, just for clarification. And a lot of our student athletes are in sports that put them at high risk for eating disorders, especially based on what they wear. Like our volleyball team, they wear very little clothes, and that can be incredibly challenging with body image. And some of our football players are asked to lose weight or gain weight, but not necessarily given the tools for how to accomplish that, and it can create eating problems. And so I've worked very closely with one of the physicians in the athletic department, which is separate than our health center. And we came up with the disordered eating and eating disorder team specifically for student athletes. And that team meets separately than the other team. And the reason for that is because she is the one doctor who is paying attention and following most of these student athletes. And she's having to track things like making sure their bones are safe for competition. So she's having to do bone density scans much more frequently than our non-athlete student population. She also has to be aware of, depending on how they're doing in therapy and especially in dietetics, of at what point does she have to pull them out of a sport for their safety. And luckily, that's a decision that she makes, not me. I am glad I am not the one making that decision. But I've known her to make it for somebody's safety. She will not let them compete or practice if she doesn't think they're safe. So it's really having to get at what the crux is for the student athlete of the eating disorder, how much of it is related to their sport, and that will indicate how much of their sport needs to be limited while they're in recovery. Sometimes they can stay in their sport and do recovery the whole time, and sometimes they can't. And so creating that team really helped with being able to hone in on their needs in a specific way.
Okay. And I imagine that must also be an extra level of difficult for college athletes because, someone who's struggling with an eating disorder on their own, at the end of the day, they may think that the only person they're letting them down is themselves. But with college athletes, there's the coach, there's the team. What kind of, role does that play in the mental health of the student who is, getting treatment for an eating disorder?
The coaches can have a huge impact, especially depending on how the coach chooses to talk to their team and how much they're talking to their team about weight and size. We've made some progress in a lot of sports not being able to weigh the student athlete, which has been helpful. But the coaches still will talk however coaches talk. And, it's some of what they say is true. But what they sometimes don't understand is that, like, for instance, in running, someone may run faster if they lose a little bit of weight. I can't argue with that. But then they will hit a point where they will start to slow down because they know if they keep losing weight, they no longer have the nutrients and the fuel to run. So even though they may lose weight at first, if they don't stop losing weight, they will start to slow down and their sport will be impacted negatively. And so that's something that I think the coaches don't necessarily understand because they may only be aware of that first part where they slow down, where they speed up. And that's a positive. They haven't really seen the other side yet. I'm hoping to be able to do more education. I am lucky enough to work on a staff where we have a licensed sports psychologist consultant. And he works with a lot of our coaches on understanding things like this. He meets with coaches. His name is Dr. Matt Johnson. He's wonderful. And so we work with that. And I think I have a little bit lost track of your question. I am so sorry.
No. Well, so you answered it partially and well about how the coach and their messaging impacts the students. So let's bring it back to, basically the extra level of like difficulty that a college athlete might face, or how their mental health might be impacted by having a coach or a team who they feel like they're letting down if their ED, gets in the way.
It can be really big. Often my student athletes talk about their teams as their families. And so when they feel like they're letting them down for any reason, they become very hard on themselves, which can actually make the eating disorder worse because it impacts and introduces more negative thoughts, more negative self-feedback. And so it really can make it worse. Especially there are some sports, especially aesthetic sports, again, volleyball, swimming, things like that, that there can often be a culture of thinness and competition on the team. So sometimes if somebody's identified as having a problem, they're just the one who got identified. They're usually not the only one. So there can be some feelings of, well, why me? I know all my peers are doing the same things. Why am I being identified as needing help? So that can be another thing that happens with the teams. I think The other thing is that we do try to, as far as therapists, we try to work with the physicians and other medical staff, which would be the trainers. I think it's very important that the counseling department, myself included, does not have contact with the coach. I think that tends to always backfire, and I would always choose to have contact with their medical providers and their trainers, because that's where I can be helpful. And as far as coaches talking to therapists, that's not something that I usually find to be helpful.
But you did mention that you have a sports psychiatrist on the team who is interacting with the coaches. So that is, great to hear.
Yeah, he's great. He's doing education and things like that.
Wonderful. And I do want to also let the audience know, if you do have any questions that you want answered in general or about what we've been speaking about, you can go ahead and put them in the chat now. And then if we have some time at the end, we'll hopefully get some answers to those. So, at the beginning of the conversation, you mentioned social media, and I did want to save some time just because, growing up in the 90s, we did have a lot of issues, as you mentioned, with the media, but we didn't have social media, and we didn't have phones in our hands constantly, a 24/7 barrage of images and videos and tips and tricks. And so can you talk a little bit about what you've seen with college students specifically, and how social media has impacted ED or just general mental health?
Well, I think that social media can sometimes get a bad rap, because I think there are positives in there. We just have to look pretty hard to find them. I think as a general rule, what some of my students call doom scrolling, where they just sit there for hours and scroll through pages, that's not very mindful, and they're looking at all of these, quote, gorgeous bodies by, American standards, people on beaches, people in bathing suits, people who are doing their 30-day cleanse, people who are doing whatever they're doing these days. I think that can be really harmful to students. And I also think that students can sometimes use social media against themselves, because they will look at past pictures of themselves. And when they're going through recovery, there's often a weight restoration process, and they will compare themselves to a month ago and 3 months ago and 6 months ago. And that can be really defeating when they see themselves at, they may have been at formal last year and now they're at formal again, and they see the memory pop up and they think it doesn't look good anymore. So social media can be really challenging in that way too. I will say there are some positives to social media. There are a lot of pro-recovery websites. And I want to be pretty clear that we want them to be pro-recovery, not necessarily healthy. The word healthy has been co-opted, and it often is being mirrored and mimicked for the word dieting. And so the word healthy doesn't mean much anymore as far as knowing if this is a pro-recovery website. But there are good pro-recovery websites. A lot of my clients like Board Panda. I also know that teaching students how to use social media in a positive way, and a lot of that is around setting time limits. Your phone will do it for you. Your phone will turn it off when you're done. If you just have to set that limit. And also being really mindful and intentional when you're on social media. You're not just doing that kind of doom scrolling. You're actually thinking about what information you're consuming and what information you want to be consuming, and changing your social media usage based on that is one of the ways that we can do better.
Got it. And is that something that the collaborative care model is working with students on, is how they're engaging with basically tech and social media?
Not as a broad stroke issue, but I would say almost every therapist is having that conversation with their clients.
Got it. Yeah. And what so far is the reception? Are most students like, yes, I know this is something that's really hard for me to control, or, are many students, immediately on board and, trying to take the steps to make sure that their interaction is something that can help them?
I actually think it's both of those things. I think it's, yes, this is really hard for me to control and really not impacting me well. And how can I make some changes? And I think with this, it's important to start with small changes. I'd love them to spend 15 minutes a day on it, but now they're at 7 hours. So to say, great, let's go to 15 minutes probably won't work. But if we can do anything in the harm reduction, if we can go from 7 hours to 6 hours, we'll be doing better. So I think that it's a combination of what you're saying.
Definitely, yeah. So another topic that I wanted to touch on, just because, part of within Summit's goal is to help the media and the communicators understand and communicate better about eating disorders specifically. And so, I don't want to necessarily talk about the negatives, but, if you are paying attention to how media covers ED, what are some newer trends that you've identified as positives? You mentioned, the word choice of switching healthy for pro recovery. So maybe a couple of examples like that.
Okay, so I'll be totally honest, you just cut out, so I didn't really hear all of your question.
Oh, okay, sorry.
I'm gonna try to answer it anyway. I think I don't know if you asked this, but I'll shoot it out real quick. I think one of the biggest misrepresentations in media is that eating disorders are thin, white, 18 to 25-year-old wealthy women, and that's the illness population. And I think that has been in movies, that's been in songs, that's been everywhere for as long as I've known. And I think that we need to change that. And is this what you were asking me?
No, but I'm happy with the direction you're going.
Oh, sorry.
No, don't apologize at all. It's the technology.
You just froze for a second. I was going to say that I think we need to do better. We do know that our trans folks have the highest rates of eating disorders, which make total sense because they're inherently uncomfortable in their bodies. So they do things like restrict to have a smaller, maybe more feminine body if this is someone who identifies as female, or they'll bulk up if they identify as male. So having to do things that bring into light the trans population being a population that is significantly impacted by eating disorders is big. Ryan Salons wrote a book. He's a speaker on this. He recovered from an eating disorder and is also a trans man. And he has 2 books written on this. If you're interested in it, they're really good. I think another thing we have to do that we have overlooked is we have to pay attention to our BIPOC community. They have been underrepresented in media. And every eating disorder movie I can think of, it's the same image. And so using some of these different images to highlight the needs in this community. It's not that the needs were not there, it's that we were not noticing them and therefore not meeting them. Roxane Gay just wrote a good book about this, so that would be another one to reach out to. I think another thing that we need to do better is recognize that size does not indicate an eating disorder. Someone can have an eating disorder at any size. There is no one size that indicates you have an eating disorder.
Yeah, it's very true. And so I do want to talk about some of because you mentioned earlier the move from using the term healthy to pro recovery. Do you notice any other, either one, terms that need to be replaced that are still often used in the media, or have you noticed, a swap that is already happening that is, a positive sign of moving in the right direction?
Healthy would be my biggest one. Other words.
If not, we can come back to that question.
I'm thinking, I think that there are still websites out there that are what we call pro ana or pro anorexia or pro mia, which is pro bulimia. And sometimes those websites will use pro recovery as a way to get someone into the website. So it's not an exact language change, but it is something to be very aware of. When you go to a pro recovery site, you need to make sure it's actually a pro recovery site, because something will say pro recovery. So you go, and then all of a sudden you're in a pro anorexia website.
That's so scary to think that there are websites out there that are trying to trick people.
They are so dangerous. They support eating disorders. People get together and support each other and how many calories they eat that day. They're awful websites. And as fast as people take them down, they're being put back up.
Wow. So what are some like signs that people can look out for to identify an actual pro recovery site?
I think looking at some of the history, looking at what's been posted over the past weeks or months. I think also looking at who's the person behind the site and Googling that separate from the site. So, or any search engine, it doesn't have to be Google, but just making sure you know who your source is.
Now, we've talked a little bit about how social media, can have positives and negatives. Because also Within Summit is put on by Within Health, and they're kind of changing the landscape around how technology is improving access to eating disorder treatment. Can you share a little bit about what you've seen as far as technology in ED treatment, and basically the transition from the 90s through to now, how technology has impacted treatment?
I think technology has been a huge improvement in treatment. And I am not someone who, if you knew me 10 years ago, I thought I'd ever say that. But we can now offer telehealth services, which in a college counseling center allows students. For me, I'm licensed in Texas. So I can now see students who leave the university and go home. If they're in the state of Texas, I can see them all summer. Whereas before, if they weren't physically located near school and could come to appointments, we had to halt for the summer. And so now I'm able to continue their treatment. And so I think that's one huge benefit for college settings. I think we now have access to things, even through dietetics, where they're using blind weight scales. I don't remember the name of it. It'll come to me. But the student or person gets a scale with no numbers, and they get on the scale and the number gets sent to their dietitian so that the dietitian can treat them virtually, still have a weight, but the student doesn't know the weight, things like that. I think also virtual IOPs and PHPs are becoming much more common. One part of the specialty track for the eating disorder track is we have now joined with a campus partner to offer an IOP on campus, which is actually not virtual, but I think a lot of students are using virtual IOPs because there aren't a lot in our area. And so they're using places like Within Health or anybody else who's offering virtual IOP or even PHP programs. We're able to get so many more people access to services that we didn't used to be able to.
Yeah, that's very, very important. So I did also want to flag we're about 5 minutes out from the end of the conversation. So if you do have any questions, go ahead and send those in. So for you, Amanda, I just wanted to ask, we've talked a lot about a lot of different topics. We've kind of bopped all over. Obviously, the entire conversation is extremely important. But if you had to pick maybe one or two items that, if the Within Summit audience leaves with anything from this conversation, let it be this. This is the most important. What do you think that, those top one or two would be?
I think the first one I want to offer is hope. Is that people with eating disorders do get better, and it can be done with the support of a college campus. And I think that we have a bigger role than we may have taken in the past because we're starting to learn how to do it better. So I think the message of hope that this is not a lifelong illness. I've heard people say that, and it really makes me sad because it's not true. There is hope within this. I think the other thing that I always like to say, I always hope people know, is that eating disorders are not about food. They're not. They're about feelings and emotions and not knowing how to express things. And food becomes the expression, but eating disorders are not about food.
And for those who, sorry, you cut out. For those who are worried that it's hopeless, or maybe are in that state of mind, or maybe some counselors out there who are working with individuals where they can sense that there is, just a lack of hope. What do you think that main motivator could be? Obviously, it's going to be different for every person, but any thoughts on that?
I often think a main motivator is looking into your own values and what do you want for your life? And do you really, I often ask the question when I meet with someone for the first time, what percentage of their time do they spend thinking about food and body weight? And I often hear numbers 80, 90. And I often ask, is that how you want to be spending your life? And the answer is never yes. So looking at what do they want? What are the values that are important to them? And what can we do to get them there? So that is often how I get there.
Got it. And so I do see a question that did just come in, but I'm not sure. So you will be able to access recordings later. The question was about CEUs and accessing recorders or recordings. So you will be able to access recordings later. As for questions about how the Zoom determines one is in the track, you can email Kath Stevens. Kath, can you just put your email in the chat real quick for anyone who has questions about CEUs specifically, so that they can contact you with any questions? And there it is. It's kstevens@withinhealth.com. So go ahead and send any questions to her. Now back to our conversation. So this entire conversation has been very, enlightening. I want to thank you so much for taking the time, and thank you so much for the work that you've been doing, with TCU. And, that message is being spread far and wide. So it sounds like it's also impacting the way that other colleges and universities are working with their students. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. I've really enjoyed this.
Wonderful.
Thanks.
Thank you.